Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we are picking back up again with The Boys. Yes, we are covering The Boys yet again. For all of you guys who love it, as always, the uncensored version will go on Patreon and the censored version will come out here on YouTube. What I'm also gonna start doing is I'm gonna start uploading videos that YouTube would normally demonetize because of their policies. I'm gonna upload those videos onto Patreon. Those will strictly go up there. And then we'll kind of go forward with Comics Explained as normal. Having said that, The Boys, I really dig this one. This one's a lot of exposition. It's one of these weird things where like Garth Ennis basically gives us like the whole mission they're going on, and then it's just a bunch of crazy things that happen in between. But all of this really picks up with a couple of situations going on. The first one is, of course, you pick up with Billy Butcher talking with, the CIA, with Susan directly in some cafe, more or less, some restaurant. But then at the same time, or at least before that, really leading into like this mission, you had a chick named Silver Kincaid, and she had the ability to control pressure or gravity. It's not explicitly defined here. It's just something going on with that. But she basically walked out to a corner on a street, asked, "Where's Uncle Paul?" and then basically killed herself. It's kind of crazy because it looks like she used pressure to kind of cave herself in, but regardless of the situation, she basically ended up dying. And so the question that goes on here is why? Like, what led to this? What was going on behind the scenes? What caused her to do this? Remember, The Boys basically function where any kind of abnormal activity that deals with superheroes is always really assigned to them by virtue of the CIA. It's the nature of their team and it's the role that they play. And so what we end up doing is learning about this group called the G-Men. Now, the reality is that the G-Men were basically designed to kind of be like a parody of the X-Men. It's really what they are, right? They're a parody of the X-Men themselves, largely because of the fact that the group is basically led by a guy named John Godolkin, who's really like a stand-in for Charles Xavier, albeit far more sinister than anything else. But what you also have is basically G-Force, G-Wiz, and G-Style. Now, these are kind of under the G-Men, right? So it's almost like you have X-Men, then you have X-Force, X-Factor, different things like that is really kind of how this compares in terms of the groups and how they work with one another. But the big question that's being asked here is, what's the deal with John Godolkin, right? Like, how does this guy function and what's going on with his character? The problem with this is that there's not really a lot of information coming out when it comes to the G-Men, right? They're not really a super clandestine group so much as a group where like people just don't really spill the beans, right? So the only way for the Boys to really learn anything about their organization is to send one of their guys in. They basically send in Huey, who's disguised as one of the G-Men. The other thing about this, which is hilarious, is the Seven keep getting crank calls. And it's one of the funniest things. Homelander gets this call where it's like, "Are there any walls there?" And it's like, "No, look, like I think you've got the wrong number." And it's like, "Then how does the roof stay up?" It's corny as hell, but it's hilarious. Like it's funny to see that happen. Because he's absolutely losing his mind. From there, that's when you basically start getting into G-Wiz, you start getting into the G-Men. Now, the idea behind this is Huey joining in as part of their group. This guy has no clue what in the world he was getting into here, right? The guy's got no earthly clue. Now, while all that's going on, you've also got Mother's Milk, who's kind of investigating from the other side. He's really focusing more on Silver Kincaid, more so than anything else. But the hope is that by investigating her, that will basically lead into maybe some trails, some breadcrumbs or something like that. They can kind of get him some information on the G-Men, and of course he and Huey can basically compare notes and see where the whole organization stands. But the problem with the G-Men is, or at least with these guys, these G-Wiz guys, is they're kind of all over the place, right? Like they're kind of bonkers insofar as the groups just sort of like let their whims and wants carry them abroad, right? It's a crazy life of like debauchery is really what it is. One of the other things that goes on is the guys routinely like jerk each other off, basically, is it, right? And it's kind of nuts. It's kind of insane once you actually start thinking about it. But that's when you also end up learning this group were the ones who were prank calling Homelander. And they got the number from like the directory, right? Is really kind of where they got this from, making all these crank calls and so on and so forth. But the big gist behind this, and really one of the big things that comes out of this, is what you have going on here is that in response to the death of Silver Kincaid, you basically got this big memorial going on with regards to all the various G-Men groups that exist out there. Now, the nature of the G-Men, and really kind of feeding into the fact that it's like a parody on the X-Men and the X-Men related universe, there's a whole bunch of different groups here, right? So you basically got the G-Brits, you've got the G-Nomads, you've got the G-Coast, G-Style, and G-Wiz. You have a whole bunch of these different organizations, these different functions that are kind of out there with regards to them, going out and doing their own thing. Something else that really seems to come out of this is that Vaughn American is aware of who the G-Men are, of everything that goes on with G-Men. They're aware of Godolkin and so on and so forth. The issue with this is that the death of Silver Kincaid, it'll drive people to start asking questions, which is exactly what's going on now. But remember, when it comes to Vaughn American, their charter, first and foremost, is make as much money as you can and don't let anybody interrupt the flow of money, right? Like the spice must flow, for those of you guys who know the reference from Dune. But still, there's a lot that goes on here with these different G-Men organizations. And so Huey getting in there and Huey basically pretending to be one of their members really passes like the initial test. And so of course, eventually he's brought before John Godolkin. And that's what the question is asked, like, why do you want to join this? And it's like, well, I've always wanted to be a superhero, which is really kind of like a pretty cut and dry answer. And it's one that's usually accepted, right? Because when it comes to the idea of the G-Men, or even with the idea of Vought American, the only thing that's really concerned about is, are you bankable? Do you have powers? And are you a person that can be marketed in such a way to where you can generate large amounts of revenue? That's the number one overriding factor when it comes to Vought American's interactions with the entirety of the superhero community. If you're not marketable, they don't care about you. If you are marketable, then they definitely care about you, right? And there's a whole host of things that go into it. In addition to that, there's small little things that kind of pop up here and there that basically tell you something's not right? Because if you look at this on the surface, it's like, okay, it's just a bunch of crazy guys who basically do all kinds of stuff. It seems part and parcel to like what Huey and all them have seen as part of the superhero community, right? There's the front public face, the marketing face of the superhero community. Then there's everything else, then there's all kinds of other stuff that goes on behind the scenes. And so looking at this, it's like, okay, it's basically just people who are a little bonkers and crazy, but for the most part, Huey sees them as relatively good guys, right? I mean, they're not going out and killing people, but what ends up happening here is in the middle of this, you end up having Huey who basically goes to the restroom only to be met by Nubia, who's just kind of there and just saying, kill me, over and over again, and scaring the absolute daylights out of Huey. Now, of course, Nubia is basically a play on the character of Storm, but when Huey starts to freak out and lose his mind, everybody else comes running in and is like, no, dude, that's the only thing she ever says. Just chill, relax, it'll be cool. And of course, there's a kind of hidden thing here where Godolkin's like, well, we've tried to stop her nighttime and, excursions. We'll go ahead and put her back and, we'll put her back where she's supposed to be. The idea is that she's almost kind of like a dirty little secret when it comes to the G-Men. It's almost kind of like no one's supposed to know what's going on with this character. Nobody's supposed to know what's going on with her. The other half of this is that where Mother's Milk is kind of tracing down this notion of Silver Kincaid, right? This idea that she was an orphan and she was ultimately rescued, or at least taken from some kind of an orphan home and basically brought to become part of the G-Men. One of the things he learns is that there's no history of her living in that location, right? There's no history of her being there. Instead, it's just kind of like, this girl seemingly just kind of appeared in the G-Men out of nowhere, and nobody really has any definitive answers as to how she got there or where she's from. The other half of this, and the reason why the G-Men are in reality kind of becoming a liability to Vought American, is it really comes by way of some statements that are offered, from Critter while they're having their morning brunch. And one of the things that Critter says here is that the G-Men concept, the ideology, has basically expanded to around like 7 or 8 teams, and you have like 6 or 7 people per team. And so the problem with this is that it creates a scenario where the more people that are out there, the more people can say something. And the reason why is it's simple numbers, right? It's much easier to control what can or cannot be said. It's much easier to control the narrative when you're talking about like 6 people, right? Because, it's just kind of like, hey, look, like I'll off all of you guys or something like that. But you can't really manage, something. I mean, if we're talking about at max, you're talking about seven people and there's 8 teams, you're talking about 56 people. One of those folks is bound to say something. So there's a lot of security issues that go on there with regards to this organization. So again, that's one of the interesting things about the G-Men is we're kind of given this depiction where you have this loose affiliation, not even really loose affiliation, but this affiliation of teams that are out there all under the banner of G-Men with no real oversight outside of like one guy, basically, and it's just kind of like, okay, so like, how do you control a group like this? How do you keep this group under wraps? How do you keep them contained and controlled? And we'll actually find out that their allegiance to Godolkin is really like second to none, but there's a pretty nefarious reason as to why that is. But one of the things that I also want to do is I want to focus here on the whole scenario with Huey and his girl. And the reason why is because with Anna and all the things that go on, what Huey's been doing is basically lying about his existence the entire time. He's been lying about the role that he plays, where he's basically been saying, well, I'm basically a guy who investigates insurance fraud, something along those lines. The problem with this is that these lies and deceit that Huey is coming out with, at some point along the line, they're going to have to come out. Like either he's going to slip or somebody's going to dump some information or something along those lines. And when the shit hits the fan, what's going to happen? Like, how's this going to play out? How's she going to respond? Is she going to lose her mind and kill him? But it's one of these crazy things where it's like Huey is becoming more and more comfortable being one of the boys than when he first started out. The boys exist by way of deceit. They exist by way of lies, manipulation. Huey was a little put off by that. He was like, I don't really know if that's the life for me. I don't really know if I can be the kind of person that can engage in those kinds of actions. But notice, it's becoming much easier for him as time goes on. It's becoming a lot easier for him to manipulate these things as time goes on. And so it's kind of a crazy scenario that you see unfold here in terms of the character progression of Huey, albeit in somewhat of a negative way. Now, following this, and this is one of the reasons why Mother Milk is so cool, is because what he's been doing is tracking down every conceivable lead he can find in terms of what's been going on with Silver Kincaid. And what he does is he basically locates a guy named Mr. Wilhelm, who basically had this younger brother named Paul, who ended up traveling out and going all the way to like a motel in Arizona and essentially offing himself. And the question is why? And this is one of the reasons why Mother Milk is so cool, right? Because Mother Milk, it's very easy to look at him as kind of being like the strong guy of the boys, right? Kind of like the muscle behind the group, and then just kind of chalk him up and just say, okay, so like, this guy doesn't have a whole lot going for him. But the guy's one heck of an investigator. And what he basically learned here, at least, talking to Mr. Wilhelm, what he learns is that at some point along the line, Paul had a niece. And the result of this was that this little girl, her name was Grace, he took her out for ice cream. And of course, once they got ice cream together, it was an amazing time. And because of his experience with her, Paul was looking forward to the idea of having a daughter himself. Of course, realizing he forgot his change, he went back into the ice cream store, and when he came out, Grace was gone. And nobody had seen anything, right? That was the only response anybody ever really gave the sheriff's office. It was like, we didn't see anything, we don't know what went on, we have no idea what happened here. This girl basically just vanished, right? She just disappeared up in smoke. And that was the biggest problem, is that try as they might, assuming that the sheriff's office gave it their all, there was nothing they could do to locate this girl. Nobody knew where she went to, nobody knew anything about her, nobody saw who took her or anything along those lines. There was no description of a vehicle, nothing. And so as a result of that, kind of driven by guilt, driven by all of this, Paul ended up driving out into a motel in Arizona and basically just offing himself, right? It was the only way he seemed to be able to cope with what was going on here. But that's when things begin to click for Mother's Milk, because when he hears that, when he's like, well, this guy Paul was her uncle, that's when it harkens back to what she said on the street corner, where's Uncle Paul? That's the cool, like, it's one of these really, really cool moments here, because it's like, it all kind of clicks into place. And so what Mother's Milk ends up doing is kind of piecing together this narrative, piecing together this story, that somewhere along the line that Uncle Paul had taken Grace to get ice cream, he went back inside, and Grace was kidnapped, presumably by John Godolkin. That kind of seems, I don't know who else it would be. I mean, he's literally the guy who's like the villain of the comic so far, or at least, in this one particular story. And she basically vanished, but because of the fact that Uncle Paul was her uncle, presumably she went through all these different experiences. Who really knows what happened, although we'll find out later on at the end of the story. And that's who she was looking for. Where's Uncle Paul? Like, I need an Uncle Paul. It's kind of a crazy thing, but there's actually a lot more going on to her character insofar as why she was the way she was. But there's this really, really cool conversation that takes place between Huey and Billy Butcher, right? Because Huey kind of finds these small little moments to basically break away and essentially report back. Of course, all these bits of information are kind of dumped out there, and of course he's planted the various monitoring devices and these bugs and so on and so forth. But what he basically says is like, look, they're not inherently bad guys. Like these are not bad guys. They're not villains, right? They're not like heroes that don't care about people or anything like that. Like, they're just kind of guys who are there and they care about each other. But I don't think that we should really be going in the direction of like, let's take these guys out, right? Because we know that Billy Butcher doesn't really much care about any of the superheroes. It's about just like taking these guys out because they're all basically various threats. If they can't be used to achieve a goal, they can be removed from the landscape. That's kind of Billy Butcher's stance on things. But the idea behind what he was telling him is, look, man, like, they're not inherently bad people. So like, if we're gonna make a move on John Godolkin and we're gonna take this guy out, at the very least, what we can do is remove these guys from the equation and try to help them become like better people, right? It's a pretty cool thing. And it's good to see that Huey hasn't fallen so far down this path that he sees all superheroes as being like irredeemable in the same fashion as Billy Butcher. So again, like, while Vought American is making moves and essentially saying these G-men have become too extreme, they've become too much of a liability, Huey is basically taken by some of the guys from the G-men, kind of brought out to not really the middle of nowhere so much as someplace sort of off the beaten path from where the reunion's going on, I guess the memorial's going on. They drag him out of the car and they basically say, we know what's going on about you, right? Like, we've been told that you're not looking to join the G-men, that you're a spy. So it's one of these instances right off the bat where Huey doesn't really get busted like immediately, but he gets busted pretty quickly. And it's kind of a funny thing here, because what this really shows, and it's one of the big moments that goes on when it comes to the nature of the boys comic, as well as like even the superheroes themselves, is that for all the pomp and circumstance of Billy Butcher, kind of pointing the finger at superheroes and saying they're not really trained to be these kind of guys, they don't really know what they're doing, the same kind of goes for the boys. They're capable, and having some influence in the CIA, things like that, does benefit them, but they're by no means perfect. And the fact that Huey got busted in this way really kind of shows, hey, these guys aren't necessarily perfect. Now, of course, Godolkin had a hand in figuring all this stuff out, but where Huey is about to basically bite the bullet, right? These guys are going to take Huey out, they're going to kill him. Suddenly he's rescued by the female as well as Frenchie, and then the rest of the boys basically join in. And what they end up doing is saving one of these members of the G-men, not really for the purpose of like making his life better, but to basically say, spill the beans, tell us what's going on here. And what we end up learning is that what Godolkin had been doing, presumably because he was abused by his father in the same way, is that when he was a kid, his father would travel around and basically kidnap children and then abuse them. And what he was doing was kind of watching the whole thing unfold. And so this sort of spilled over and became a core part of John Godolkin's life, so that what he was doing was going out and kidnapping young kids. The difference is that he wasn't doing it for the sole purpose of abusing him. What he was doing it for the purpose of building up a superhero team, creating the G-men. And so what he would do is once these kids were kidnapped, they would constantly inject them like once a week with Compound V, the serum that gives people superpowers. And one of two things would happen. Either they would develop powers or they would die. And that was just the way it was. And so as a result of that, for those individuals who lived, who ended up kind of going on and basically developing abilities, they would in turn be incorporated into the G-Men and then basically go forward doing the bidding of John Godolkin. The reason why Vought American allowed this to go on for so long is because the G-Men produced a ton of money, right? I mean, they were basically viewed as like cast-offs, as people whose, by virtue of their power manifesting had like a kind of a different appearance or something like that, but they were viewed as like the underdog, and people love an underdog. And so they basically generated a ton of money for Vought American, which is why Vought American sort of let it go on. The other half of this is that what Godolkin was doing was basically abusing these children himself. At the same time, once that abuse sort of went through, the kids just kind of let it go and just sort of navigated those waters, because what Godolkin would do in turn is he would basically allow them to explore every fantasy they had, every toy they ever wanted to play with, everything they ever wanted to do. Godolkin would let them do that. The one rule that existed among the G-Men is nobody rats out the other G-Men. You don't tell anybody what goes on inside this G-Men group. And so they were basically raised with this ideology of never tell anybody what happens to you, and you'll be able to continue living this amazing life. And when you're a little kid and you're as easily manipulable as the kids that are shown in here, and you're basically given every opportunity to do whatever it is that you want, it's pretty screwed up. Like, it's pretty dark and it's pretty twisted. And so as a result of that, what you end up basically getting is this notion of these kids going forward and basically swearing absolute allegiance to John Godolkin, basically saying like, we're never gonna rat this guy out, we're never gonna turn on this guy. And, once you end up having like Billy Butcher and all of his forces, or I guess really him and just the boys, who end up going to confront all these various superheroes, none of it makes a difference, because seemingly out of nowhere, you have all these soldiers, all these henchmen for Vought American who come running in here with Stinger missiles, with helicopters, flamethrowers, and just torch everything. They torch and eliminate everyone, like every single member of these G-Men. It's literally just like a great big huge sanitation project. They sanitize everything. They eliminate all of them, like all of them are gone. And the reason why is because now there's no more liability. There's no more having to worry about other people talking. At the same time, what you also ended up having, and one of the things that's kind of alluded to here, is that Vought American cleaned up all the toddlers, right? Like all those little kids. It's literally cutthroat and ruthless. They eliminated any loose strings. Like everybody's basically gone. It's one of the most brutal depictions that I think I've ever seen in really in like comic books, in terms of like just cold-heartedness. But nonetheless, it's pretty extreme. And what it really does is it points to this idea that nothing is beyond Vought American. They'll do whatever they need to in order to make sure that their assets, their profits are kept in line, that nobody gets in the way, that nobody stops the flow of money. And they're willing to cut off some money. They're willing to cut off the financial flow from the G-Men so long as nobody gets in the way, right? And here's kind of the crazy thing about it. Because Vought American approaches this from a marketing standpoint, what they could really do here is they could spin the narrative to say any number of things. Some extreme group out there, whatever the case is, they went through and took out all the G-Men. And so that way, Vought American kind of paints them as like martyrs, more or less. And so that way, it'll increase the sales of their comic books, and Vought American will continue making money. It's pretty nefarious and it's pretty extreme, but it's the way in which their organization functions. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.